New Prospect, welcome to RTB 2021 for April 15th, 2021. So we've got some really good text today, and text that we could spend a lot of time on. A very famous text, even in some cases, but we'll dive right on in. We've got Leviticus 19, we've got Psalm 23 and 24, and then we have Ecclesiastes 2, and then 1 Timothy chapter 4. So why don't we dive right into Leviticus 19? So Leviticus 19 is the heart of the Holiness Code. And again, remember, the Holiness Code is all about instructing the Israelites as a covenant community faith. How do you live out your life in covenant community? How do you live out your life in a way that's going to separate yourself out from the world and show that you're dedicated to God? And it begins in verse 2, where it says, "You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." And of course, this is something that's not just an admonition for the Old Testament, but also for New Testament Christians as well. Because when you go to 1 Peter, what does he do? He quotes that same verse in chapter 1 of 1 Peter. And so we have in this text something that Christians should be striving for as well. Now, some of these texts, I want to make a controversial statement here. I think what you find in these texts are some really strange laws that could be really hard for us to apply to today. But I think, and I will say this, I think rightly understood, I think every one of these laws are applicable for today as well, if rightly understood in their cultural context, if you understand the principle behind them. So for instance, not harvesting the edges of your field. Well, most of us are not farmers today, but if you read through that text, it's specifically showing that as a covenant community faith, Israel should be leaving some things of their produce, of what they produce as individuals, for the poorest of the poor. And so one of the ways in which they would distinguish themselves out from the world around them and show that they're dedicated to God is by caring for those who are the poor, the outcast, the orphan, and providing for them. And we see a great example of this, by the way, in the book of Ruth with Boaz, who does this very thing and even goes above and beyond what's detailed here in this verse. Something like the admonition against tattoos. Well, tattoos in the ancient culture was a way of identifying yourself with pagan elements of society. Well, we don't want to do anything outwardly that identifies us publicly with something that's a pagan element of society. We need to be showing ourselves to be dedicated to God and separate out from the world. Even the laws on sacrifices that you find in Leviticus 19 are showing that as well, that one of the ways in which we separate ourselves out from the world and show ourselves to be dedicated to God is that we, of course, have experienced the once for all sacrifice of Jesus. So all these things that are detailed in Leviticus 19, I think, show us something about how we are to, even today, live our lives as a people of God. The other thing I would say about Leviticus 19 is you'll see that it deals with all kinds of different issues. And it again shows, I think, that all of life is an expression of worship. All of life is an expression of holiness. All of life should be something that is showing that we're dedicated to God and separated out from the world. There's no compartmentalization of life, in other words, where we say, okay, God, you can have this part of my life, but not this part. So that's Leviticus 19. Let's go to Psalm 23 and 24. Now, obviously, Psalm 23, pretty famous psalm. And yet, I think when we read Psalm 23, let me encourage you with a different way of reading it. The language used here, and my students will laugh at this, is very much covenantal language. And this gets a little bit more clear as you go to the end of Psalm 23 and verse 6. Surely goodness and chesed, loving kindness, will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This is what God does in covenant relationship with his people. But specifically, since this is a psalm of David, right? This is the king who is singing this. The Lord is his shepherd, the king's shepherd. He will guide and he will provide for the king. And of course, what Jesus does is he is as our true King. He extends this privilege to us, and we are in right covenant relationship. Loving kindness is following and pursuing after us, and we have the enjoyment of God's presence forever because of our King, because of Jesus. And so I think we readily apply this to ourselves, and rightly so, this wonderful psalm. But let me encourage you to apply it by seeing Jesus ultimately as the first fulfillment of this text, and that we are the beneficiaries of God's watch care over His Son Jesus Christ. I hope that makes sense. Then Psalm 24 is a psalm that celebrates the King of Glory. And this is one that we often employ as part of our worship services, especially in the second service in verse 8. Who is the King of Glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. And it is a psalm that celebrates God's kingship over all the earth. And again, God's the psalmist, and I've said this before, his primary way of understanding God is God as King. And who can ascend to, this is similar, very similar to Psalm 15. Asks the question, who can ascend to the hill of the Lord, who may stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who's not lifted up his soul to falsehood. Well, who is that? Well, none of us, Psalm 14 tells us. And yet, at the same time, we have that access because our King Jesus, has the clean hands. He has the pure heart. He is that King of Glory that allows us to go before the King of the universe, God the Father. So, Psalm 24. Moving on to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Now, Ecclesiastes 2. In Ecclesiastes 2, we're kind of continuing the same idea where the Koheleth, the preacher, is one who is experimenting on all the things that life can throw at you that perhaps you might think might bring meaning and purpose to life. He's searching again for that advantage, that profit, that advancement in life. And he considers all these activities, verse 11, that could be done. All the things that he's done, whether it's his work, his labor, is verse 18 and following, even wisdom itself. And all these things, because they are in this world of space and time, and because they are passing, all these pleasures of men he speaks about, they are striving after the wind. They are vanity. And so this is, again, I think, a great text to present the gospel with. But you really want to do it with the entirety of the book, right? Because we'll explore at the end of the book what actually does bring meaning to life. But at this point in time, he's really driving us to a sense of almost despair here, because the things that everyone mostly pursues in this world as bringing meaning, well, really it doesn't, because ultimately these things are not going to fulfill that purpose that we have in life. And that brings us to 1 Timothy chapter 4, where Paul is giving some closing exhortations to Timothy, warning him, for instance, in verse 1, that there will be those who even fall away from the faith. And yet he says, this is what you need to be concentrating on doing, Timothy, and that is to discipline yourself for the purpose of godliness. Now, if you remember last year, we preached on what I call the spiritual disciplines. And spiritual disciplines are, again, those things that place us in the path of God's grace. They are habits of the spiritual life that allow us to grow in godliness and Christ-likeness. And here, Paul is telling them that, we discipline our bodies for other things physically, but a greater concern is disciplining ourselves, developing these habits that will ultimately pursue godliness. And I think that's a good admonition, not just to leaders within the church, once again, but to all of us. And I think that's about all that I want to say about this particular text. It gives some final exhortations here at the end, and that moves on into chapter 5. But that's a good way, I think, of thinking about what really kind of what we're doing throughout the entirety of this year. Through RTB 2021 is we're disciplining ourselves. It's not easy to get up and read through scriptures or to take time at the end of the day after you're tired and worn out to read through the texts that are allotted for that day. It's a discipline, isn't it? And yet we're doing it to place ourselves in the path of God's grace and to grow in Christ's likeness. And this is true for any of the spiritual disciplines that we talked about last year, whether it's fasting, prayer, silence and solitude, whether it's even something like learning and journaling. These are all important spiritual disciplines, and yet they are things that ultimately have a larger purpose, and that is disciplining ourselves for that purpose of godliness and Christ likeness. So, hope you have a great rest of the day, and I hope we will all continue disciplining ourselves for this purpose.